Avoidants make these assumptions after you go silent on them. When you go silent on a dismissive avoidant, something powerful begins to shift, something most people never see because avoidants hide it behind calm faces, short replies, and emotional distance. On the surface, it looks like they don't care. They look unaffected, detached, and sometimes even relieved. But inside their mind, a storm begins quietly, slowly, and secretly. Today, we're diving deep into the assumptions avoidants make when you suddenly stop chasing, stop texting, and stop trying to fix the connection. These assumptions aren't always logical, and they aren't always fair, but they reveal exactly how avoidants think about relationships, vulnerability, and emotional closeness. The first thing a dismissive avoidant assumes after you go silent is that you're finally done pressuring them. Avoidants are hypersensitive to emotional demands. They feel overwhelmed when someone needs too much closeness, consistency, or reassurance. Even if you weren't actually pressuring them, their nervous system interprets emotional intimacy as something dangerous. So when you pull back, your silence feels like space they can breathe in. They assume you're no longer expecting anything from them. That assumption creates temporary relief, but relief is not the same as indifference. What feels like comfort at first will evolve into something very different as time passes. The second assumption avoidants make is that they were right about you all along. Avoidants carry a core belief. People always leave, or people always end up disappointed in me. So when you go silent, they interpret it as confirmation. They think, of course, I knew it. Nobody stays. It doesn't matter if you went silent because they pulled away first. Avoidants rewrite the story in their mind to protect their self-image. The truth is, they assume abandonment even when they push people away. So your silence becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy for them, one they rely on to avoid facing their own vulnerability. Another assumption an avoidant makes when you stop reaching out is that you're angry, upset, or punishing them. Avoidants were raised in environments where emotional withdrawal was used as a coping mechanism. When someone goes quiet, their nervous system doesn't see it as a boundary. It sees it as a threat. They assume you're mad. They assume you're trying to manipulate them. They assume you want them to chase you, even though that's the last thing they're comfortable doing. This assumption forces them deeper into avoidance. They shut down even more emotionally because they don't know how to deal with conflict or emotional tension. Silence feels like danger, not clarity, but eventually the assumptions start to shift. After some time, a dismissive avoidant begins making the assumption that you've moved on to someone else. The avoidant fear of being replaced is real, no matter how confident they seem. When you stop giving them attention, they wonder who's getting it now. Their mind starts whispering, is there someone new? Avoidants don't like competing for emotional space, even though they distance themselves in relationships. They assume your silence means you're giving what you once gave them to someone else. And here's the twist. This assumption can trigger jealousy, insecurity, and even a hidden desire to reconnect, though they'll never admit it openly. Another powerful assumption they make is that you don't need them anymore. Avoidants have a complicated relationship with being needed. On one hand, they dislike emotional dependence. On the other hand, being needed gives them a sense of value without demanding vulnerability from them. So when you go silent, they assume that value is gone. They assume you found strength outside the connection, and part of them resents it, because despite their independence, avoidants still want to feel chosen, just not overwhelmed. Your silence becomes a message. I'm okay without you. And that message shakes them more than they'll ever admit. Then comes the assumption that surprises even them. They assume you might actually be happier without them. Avoidants carry a hidden fear. They believe they're not good at relationships. They believe they can't give enough emotionally. When you disappear from their life, they assume you're experiencing peace. They imagine you feeling lighter, freer, less stressed. This assumption is painful for them, but they convince themselves it's true because it allows them to avoid confronting their emotional shortcomings. It's easier for them to think you're better off than to accept they caused the distance. After your silence lingers, avoidants begin making a new assumption. You expect them to reach out first, and here's where things get complicated. They don't want to reach out. Reaching out feels like vulnerability. It feels like surrender. It feels like they're risking rejection. So they assume you're waiting for them to make the first move, but they're terrified of doing it. This creates a silent standoff. You're waiting for remorse. They're waiting for safety. Both of you feel the tension. No one breaks it. Eventually, an avoidant makes perhaps their most revealing assumption. They assume you're doing this to test them. Avoidants hate tests because they often feel they'll fail them. They assume your silence is a strategy. They assume you're checking if they care, checking if they'll chase, checking if they'll change. Instead of seeing your silence as self-respect, they see it as a challenge. And avoidants don't respond well to challenges. They retreat. They close up. They wait it out in silence, believing that the safest move is no move at all. But let's talk about the assumption that actually bothers them the most. They assume you've finally seen their flaws clearly. When you go silent, avoidants believe you've had enough time to think, and that thinking has made you realize they're emotionally unavailable, inconsistent, guarded, and hard to love. Avoidants are painfully aware of their shortcomings. They just don't talk about them. So they assume your silence means you're finally done tolerating what they couldn't fix. This thought never leaves them, even if they pretend not to care. And then something shifts. After enough time has passed, avoidants make a surprising assumption. You might come back on your own. Avoidants rely heavily on hope without action. They assume that if they just stay quiet and avoid conflict long enough, the problem will resolve itself. They assume you'll return after cooling down. They assume you'll chase them again because you always have. But when you don't, when you stay silent, when you hold your boundary, it completely destabilizes their internal world. This is when they realize the silence is real. This is when assumptions start turning into fears. One of these fears becomes an assumption that keeps them awake at night. They assume you no longer see them as special. Avoidants want closeness in the background. They want to feel valued without being vulnerable. But your silence creates a narrative in their mind. They assume they've lost their special place in your life. They assume someone else might be making you feel things they never could. They assume they've faded from your emotional world. And this assumption is the one that begins to create regret. Finally, avoidants make the assumption they fight hardest to hide. They assume they might have actually cared more than they let on. Silence forces them to confront feelings they avoided. Missing you, thinking about you, wondering if they pushed too far. Avoidants don't enjoy sitting with emotions, they avoid them. But your silence puts those emotions right in front of them, impossible to escape. And so the final assumption forms quietly, softly. Maybe I did feel more, and maybe I lost someone who mattered. And that's the truth about avoidance when you go silent. They won't show it. They won't say it. They won't reach out easily. But your silence speaks louder than any words. It reveals their fears, exposes their wounds, and forces them to confront what they've been avoiding their entire life: intimacy, vulnerability, and the possibility that they've just lost someone who cared.